Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted you're joining us for more evidence-led discussion about the topics that are critical to the way we manage our water and environment. A huge thanks to Skewb, who are our season sponsor for Season 4, and you'll hear a little more about Skewb later. We're hugely grateful for their support. If you're new to the pod, I'm Niki Roach, and alongside being a passionate advocate for all things water and environment, I'm a fellow of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. Our members in over 90 countries are professionals with a breadth and depth of expertise in the topics that are shaping the future of our planet. So let's get started, and in today's episode, we're talking about climate change, another huge topic, and we're joined by a superb co-host who's going to help us bring such a broad challenge into slightly clearer focus, Susan Stockwell. Susan is a culture and change focused managing director with over 2 decades of commercial and operational leadership across sectors including water and electricity, and is currently the managing director of Skewb Green. And Susan's also an independent board member for London Travel Watch. And at Skewb, Susan's continuing the growth of innovative sustainability, net zero and ESG services, products and digital solutions. So welcome, Susan. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Niki. It's great to be here.
Our guest interview today is with the Right Honourable John Gummer, Lord Deben. Lord Deben is chairman of the Committee on Climate Change and Valpak Limited. He was the longest serving Secretary of State for the Environment the UK's ever had between 1993 and 97, and his 16 years of top-level ministerial experience also include Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, Minister for London, Employment Minister and Paymaster General in HM Treasury. He's consistently championed an identity between environmental concerns and business sense, and I was really interested to hear how Lord Deben's thoughts on the importance of the government setting standards to enable companies to do the right thing.
It's no good leaving it to the house builders to decide that they will improve the standards. There'll be one or two, like Redrow, for example, which is now not going to build houses which don't have heat pumps. But most of the others, particularly people like Persimmon, are not going to move unless the government improves the standards which they insist upon.
So, Susan, before we hear the interview, what's the landscape like for tackling the big challenge of climate change within some of the organisations you're working with?
Yeah, it's fascinating, Niki, to be honest. I mean, we work across a number of different organisations, and I think generally what I see is that most organisations have set down their ambition. They've set down probably their targets. They've thought a little bit around how they're going to achieve net zero by 2030. I think the interesting thing for me that I don't always see, and this is where I think the focus needs to be, is the plans to make it happen. Yeah, that's where I'm really beginning to see it in a number of different sectors, a number of different organisations. Is got some great ideas, great thoughts, great ambitions, but not so much of the plans to make it happen.
Well, that is a perfect segue, really, I think, into the interview with Lord Deben, because he's got a real focus on exactly that. How do we transition from strategy into delivery? So let's listen to the interview with Lord Deben. Here it is. Well, welcome to Planet Possible, Lord Deben.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here.
I'd like to start, if we can, by looking backwards and thinking about COP27 and the absence of a formal agreement on whether that 1.5 degree target is still alive, and particularly in light of the creation of a new UK government department, for energy security and net zero, which we'll come on to. What do you and the Climate Change Committee Secretariat think about how COP27 went?
Well, it's always true that one wants more than one gets. It was always true that 26 had been such a reasonable success. Again, one would have liked more, but it was. That 27 was bound to be much more difficult. And the important thing was at least a commitment that there was a real issue about helping those countries which were suffering from climate change but had done practically nothing to cause it. So that was the key decision. The 1.5, in a sense, we've got a programme to keep the temperature rise below 2 and, if possible, down to 1.5. That continues. We've got to fight for that battle. And if it moves above that, the damage done is enormous. And my own view is that as we go on, I mean, literally in the months, not the years, but the months, people will see that. And therefore it becomes more and more urgent. And every country is now suffering from climate change, and only those who close their eyes and refuse to accept it can possibly explain the bushfires in one place, the floods in another place, the terrible storms, and the sort of thing that we're seeing literally every day. So it's almost not become news, some of the things that happen. If you look in this very day, if you look at the North Island of New Zealand, and see what's happening there, and then you go across and see what's happening at the same time in Australia and in California. This is a very, very serious thing, and therefore I believe we will keep this and fight for it and demand it because it's so necessary.
I'm very hopeful that you're right, and I share your positivity and optimism. If we think then about practically some of the levers that we can pull to address climate change, in your view, the kind of relative importance of government, kind of businesses and corporates and individuals, how do you see the kind of relative importance of each of those levers?
Well, I think, as usual, everybody has a role to play. I mean, government has got to set the parameters within which business can do its job. And business does look to government for that, because otherwise the people who are doing the job properly get undermined by the people who aren't doing the job properly. So the government has to set that. So if you take the house building world, it's no good leaving it to the house builders to decide that they will improve the standards. There'll be one or two, like Redrow, for example, which is now not going to build houses which don't have heat pumps. But most of the others, particularly people like Persimmon, are not going to move unless the government improves the standards which they insist upon. And we need to do that urgently, for example, in that case. And then you've also got the government's role, either directly or through local government, of ensuring that those standards are met. So that bit, the regulatory bit, which is something I think that the Chancellor has understood, the regulatory bit is a crucial part of setting the scene for business to operate. For example, you need to change the planning laws so that no planning permission may be given except in conformity with our commitment to net zero. That would, for example, have stopped ExxonMobil building a new pipeline from Fawley, where it's stationed in Southampton, to Heathrow, because the fact is that we're not going to have an increased use of fossil fuels. We're going to have to reduce that. So it's that kind of thing which really has to be conformed with the government's regulation. But then business has got to do its part, and I'm very impressed with the fact that there's been such a change since the Paris Agreement, but particularly over the last 3 years, where the finance world has begun to realise that it has got to look at sustainability generally and the climate change in particular when it comes to invest, because it doesn't want to have stranded assets. That's the change that has taken place. And what we've got to do is to encourage that change and also to call out the people who are either not doing things at all or using greenwash to cover up the fact that they're not doing things at all. And we ought to be willing to praise companies which really are trying hard to get these things right. And there are so many of them now that they deserve to have some sort of advantage for having done it right.
So if we talk about that specifically then, I mean, things like carbon taxes have been talked about. I mean, there's obviously the carrot and stick approach. So tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking when you talk about, praising businesses is one thing, but would you go further than that?
I think it's true that you need to look at the taxation system altogether to refurbish it so that it suits the world in which we live. Now, there are some obvious examples of that. At the moment, we get a lot of tax from using fossil fuels. As we have more and more electric cars, that source of tax will fall. So we have to find another way of doing that. Now, in finding that other way, which may be, for example, road pricing, it's not for me to say how you would do it, but what you would do would be to make sure that what you do is in fact something which itself helps the environment, so that the mechanism you're using means that people pay more for doing things which are costly to the community as far as the environment is concerned. And you can do a lot in tax in that way. And the Climate Change Committee has specifically said that they want the government to look at the taxation system as a whole, because it can be that sort of driver. And in America, for example, President Biden has shown that by his very interesting and rather challenging use of tax and reward in the anti-inflationary act that he's passed. And of course, not only is it very imaginative in that way, but it also ties people into it, because it means that it's very difficult to go back on it, because people are now dependent on it. And in the febrile politics of the United States, that's a very clever move.
If we think about individuals, we've talked a little bit about government and we've talked about business and kind of corporate world. What about individuals? Where do they sort of stack up in all of this? Because there's a lot of passion and there's a lot of momentum, I think, behind, even things like Extinction Rebellion. And then for CIWEN members, our professionals are working in this space all the time. What more do you think we could be doing as individuals, if anything?
First of all, we have to do the thing ourselves. I mean, the boring things which are really add up to so much, like turning off the lights and like only boiling as much water for the cup of coffee that you really need and not a whole kettle full. I mean, all those things which are not terribly exciting, not running the water while you're cleaning your teeth, all those. But if you look at how much that adds up if everybody did it, it's enormous. I mean, it really does make a huge difference. And so that whole collection. And the second thing is actually positively changing, and that means things like trying to use less energy by creating circumstances in your home that's possible. And I don't mean just big things. When you replace a boiler, that of course is a big thing, and you need to think about how you do that in the most environmentally friendly way. But most people will go on with the boiler they've got because it would be not very environmentally sensible to throw it away, so to speak, just because there's a better way of doing it. But there's no reason why you can't go around the house and make a huge difference by very small things. The cost of additional insulation in the roof is very small. One of the things people don't notice, there are places where air comes in and is particularly bad through the letterbox. I'm always amazed at the number of people who don't have a flap over the back of the letterbox. And I know it sounds very small, but people come with cracked windows. Things that really don't cost a huge amount to do, but if you do them, they matter. So that's the second lot of things, which are things you can do, ranging from major change, like double glazing, like replacing the gas boiler with a heat pump, all those big things, ranging from that right down to the flap on the back of the letterbox. And then there's the third thing, which is the way in which we choose our products. We've got to get better at this. For example, I don't believe in disinvestment, because I do think that we've got to help these big oil and gas companies move from being fossil fuel companies to being renewable companies. And you can't do that without the investment. So don't disinvest, but choose where the investment is. If you have shares, then perfectly happily have shares in Shell, but keep Shell's feet to the fire to do it. But don't have shares in ExxonMobil, because ExxonMobil isn't trying and isn't doing the things it should do. So you shouldn't be involved in it. You shouldn't buy Esso Petrol, but you do buy Total or Shell or BP, because although none of them are doing it as well as I'd like them to, I want to press them further, but they are actually on the right route. So you make those choices. And it's true about, if I may say so, it's about clothing. You look at the companies where quite clearly they haven't met the highest standards, so you don't buy Boohoo's clothes because you know that they are not meeting the standards which you would expect. And you look at the others and you can see that there are other major companies which are and do care about it. And you have to do that in our own personal lives, asking the question always, what's the best thing that we can do for the planet on this?
You're absolutely right. It's incremental gains, isn't it? There's lots of little things that you can do as well as the big stuff. And interestingly, I think in the middle of a cost of living crisis, in some respects, there's an added incentive, isn't there? Because actually the price of energy bills themselves is so astronomical now that actually any saving that you can make, you'll feel in your pocket much more directly, I think, than perhaps previously.
We do have too much stuff. And just thinking about whether we really need to buy some of the things that we buy and whether there isn't a better way of doing it. Not because I want in any way for people to be miserable. I'm a great sort of optimist about it all. And I just want to live in the same sort of way as we do, but without costing the planet. And I do think that we have become too enamoured with stuff. And there's quite a lot we can do without and still be quite as happy, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm probably guilty as charged there a little bit. I do try, but yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We can't buy ourselves out of this. Let's think a little bit now about the creation of this new government department. So we've now got the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it was a genuine desire to concentrate the minds on those issues. I mean, the thing is that the cost of living crisis demands exactly the same actions as we need for fighting climate change. It means that we have to ensure that we use less energy to get the same results. So energy efficiency is absolutely the heart of it. Secondly, we've got to have an energy system which is renewable, because that is the lowest cost energy production. You need that for the cost of living crisis too. That coming together makes that department much more sensible than it would have been perhaps some time ago. And so I think that is a good change. It will be judged, of course, on the outcome. Now, Grant Shapps has so far shown himself very much to understand what we're dealing with. So I'm very hopeful for that. So we will see. But as usual, I'm the independent chairman of the Climate Change Committee, and I base my views entirely on outcomes, because all politicians find it easier to talk about policy than delivery. And delivery in political terms is always difficult. It's always easier to be more green in opposition than in government, because you don't have to make the actual decisions and deal with it. So we all the time, one wants to measure as one does one's own life. You know, if you talk about other people, the people that you admire are not the people who talk, it's the people who deliver. And it's delivery is the thing that really matters.
Do you think there's any risk that energy becomes a silo in government? And I suppose I ask that specifically as somebody who's got a background in water, and water and energy are, inextricably linked, really. There are so many connections when we talk about heating water in the home. That's 6% of UK carbon emissions, for example. Is there a risk that by focusing on energy as a department that we lose some of those connections, or we don't make the most of the opportunities that they present, do you think?
Well, I think there's a risk, but it's the same risk as you have with government all the time. I mean, the problem with government is that it is siloed, and that there are too many departments that actually think that this is all for what was BEIS and DEFRA. And actually it's for everybody. And I keep on pointing to the fact the Ministry of Defence has understood this. It is doing very well in its battle to this. Oddly enough, the local government department doesn't seem to have done that, still is not. They really haven't learnt that the future progress of the battle against climate change is a partnership between government and local government. And there's something about that department which has always been true. It was true when I was the Secretary of State, that I'm afraid that civil servants at the centre don't really trust their colleagues in local government. And that's why I'm very much in favour of Lisa Stewart's programme, in which they are seeking to link the two together and train them together and have clearer joint programme for the future and for their development and careers. I just think we've got to recognise that local government and national government are partners, and we're not good at that. We never have been, and that's why devolution is so difficult. Ministers do it. It's all there, but in the end, it's a sort of handout from government, so the local authority doesn't have the responsibility or the accountability, and government itself then blames the local authority, and the local authority blames government, and we don't have a partnership, and that's what we really have to do. There are so many places we could start it. I mean, if you look at the West Midlands Combined Authority, if you look at Manchester, Teesside, there are very clearly authorities of both political parties which would be prepared and must be prepared to cooperate with government if government will put the hand out and do it. The worry you've got is right, but that is true in any case, and you've just got to. This is why we do support the Skidmore proposal for a net zero delivery authority, so that it would be responsible for the detailed delivery, and therefore it could call on the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and say, you've really got to say, if you're going to give grants to theatres, you really do have to tie that with them reducing their energy. which is we've just given huge amounts of grants to theatres to get them through COVID, which is absolutely right. None of them had anything to do with concerns about the environment and the question of emissions, whereas every one of them should have that. And it's really what we've been talking about the individual. Government departments and individual ministers and individual civil servants should be looking at everything through that lens. How does this contribute to our battle against climate change?
Planet Possible is sponsored by Skewb, who are at the forefront of innovation, collaboration, digital excellence and customer experience. They help to enable their customers to continuously improve operational efficiencies whilst recognising the importance of and addressing industry-wide challenges such as climate change, the journey to net zero and regularly evolving regulation. At their heart, Skewb believe collaboration with customers and industry partners is fundamental to building transformative solutions across the utility sector that ultimately benefit their customers, the consumer and our environment. Can we turn to the work of the Climate Change Committee now a little? And I wanted to just reflect a little bit. And when I was preparing for this conversation, SIWEM have a climate change panel. And so I spoke to the panel and said, what would you really like me to ask Lord Deben? And one of the things that they sort of raised was, so since 2007, we've had 15 major flooding incidents. We've seen over 100,000 homes and businesses flooded. And we've had unfortunate fatalities as well due to weather-related flood events. And then last summer, we saw record temperatures across the UK. So I looked back across the annual reports that the Climate Change Committee prepared to Parliament, and there's a really clear theme. So 2018, you concluded, act now, climate change will not pause while we consider our options. 2019, it's time to act. Our credibility in the COP26 presidency rests on real action at home. 2020, we say to the government, act courageously. It's there for the taking. 2021, our message to government is simple. Act quickly, be bold and decisive. Your moment has arrived. And finally, last year, the government has set the right course, but it has now to deliver on the scale and urgency that's required. And I was left thinking, to you, Lord Deben, does it feel like an emergency to the government, do you think?
Well, first of all, it is an emergency. And secondly, emergency needs immediate action. If you measure the government by outcomes, no, it doesn't feel like an emergency at all. I mean, let me give you one example which you haven't shown there, but wildfires. There's been a huge increase in wildfires because if you have very much hotter weather and very much less water at the same time, you get wildfires. Now, if you remember last year, we had wildfires very close to town, particularly close to London. There was that terrible fire which burnt a whole row of houses out because of the fields behind, which must have been very much their lovely view, because that caught fire. Now, the London Fire Brigade doesn't have the equipment to deal with fires on fields because it never had to do that. Its vehicles are meant for roads and it runs from hydrants, so you've got to think differently. Now, that is true of almost all the fire services which were called out during that year, last year. I did a little bit of a look at it the other day. None of them have had the changes that you would expect in order to do it in the future. So they've all treated it, and the government has treated it as if it was a one-off. It isn't a one-off. We're going to have very likely this year, certainly in the next couple of years, similar kind of weather. This isn't the problem. And therefore, we've got to make those changes. And if we're talking about flooding, we've actually got to have a much more sensible land policy. So we plant trees in places where that helps to slow the water down. All those things that we have to do. It's not just building flood defences. It's about the natural ways of dealing with it. And that's what we've got to do. And I just feel very strongly that the difficulty now is that nobody, apart from a few absolutely purblind individuals, but nobody really says that they don't believe in climate change. But then they act as if they don't believe in climate change. Because if you believe in climate change, you realise just how threatening it is. So we come back to it. It's a question of action, and action now, action this day. And of course, inaction is something which governments and civil servants, local authority servants, I'm afraid, are prone to, because it's difficult to make a decision. And one of the things that is most difficult is that government doesn't seem to gather that not making a decision is exactly the same as making a decision. You don't get out of it by just not doing it, because that itself is a decision with a real result. So I shall go on pressing them and keeping their feet to the fire, and I believe that it'll be true of any government. It isn't just this government, it is all governments, because it's part of the problem of government. And if only governments would stop having focus groups and listening to what they think people want, and start recognising that leadership is what people deep down want. And what has been so bad over the past 10 years, really, how on earth could we have ended up with an election in which we were to choose between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn? That is not a proper choice in a democracy. We now do have all three political parties led by people who are in fact decent individuals, and the choice becomes very different. But it'll take a long time to recalibrate our system, and then we need people who will stand up and say, this is what's right, and we are saying this because we have to do this, and then are prepared to give the information and the encouragement to people to accept it.
In your role as the chair of the Climate Change Committee, have you got the tools at your disposal to drive the change that you think is needed?
Well, yes, in the sense that doing the job we do, but our job is, after all, to give the government the tools to do this. In the end, the democracy element is hugely important. So that's why we produce the budgets. Then government presents that to Parliament. Parliament has then, in every case, all 6 budgets, has then passed those budgets. And they then become law, which is unique in Britain. They become law. And what's more, we have this very important element, which is that they can't be changed without the Climate Change Committee agreeing. So we've got the fundamentals here. I don't want the power to decide whether there should be a new runway of this airport and not one of that. That must be the government. I need and have the power to say, that's your envelope for the emissions. And you can decide, it's for government to decide what within that envelope should be done. Now, sometimes they make mistakes. Very often I'd have done it differently, but then I'm not the government. That is a proper relationship in that sense. Every now and again we do have to say that certain actions are manifestly not right. And so giving the planning permission for the Cumbrian coal mine is not right. It is not acceptable to start digging coal, even if you claim that it is not for generation. The fact is you're going to export more than 80% of that coal, and the only countries that will buy it are countries that are not meeting their climate change commitments or having climate change commitments. So it is unacceptable, and that's why we said so, and that's why we will support any move to stop it.
So if we think a little bit more then in that case about adaptation, one of the key parts of climate change, one of the things that the panel were really interested in is whether you think that we should be amending the Climate Change Act to make adaptation a legal requirement. What are your thoughts?
I'm not in favour of altering the Climate Change Act because there's a great deal to be said for it to be that solid, continuing act which was passed and which we stick to. There's a constitutional element about that, which I think is, you don't want to reopen that anyway. But I do think that there are changes that can be made on adaptation. We produce this adaptation 5-year plan. Actually, we've got to make it a much more legally necessary plan. We've got to find a way of including its recommendations as something you put before Parliament. We've got to get the government to move much faster on these things. I mean, it's been good, for example, on the money that it's finally given for flood defences, but it's not been good on the money that is necessary to keep up the defences we've got. So if we're not careful, we'll have new ones and the old ones will not be doing their job. It hasn't faced up to the fact that the Environment Agency has been bereft of its funding and of its independence, both of which, as I invented it, Minister, I funded it much more generously, and I insisted upon it being independent. And I told the first chairman, I want you to criticise me. That's what you're there for. We've moved to the situation in which the chairman isn't supposed to criticise the government and doesn't have enough money to do the job that it actually has of invigilation. I mean, what it is supposed to do is to make sure that the environmental laws that we pass are in fact imposed. And that's not happening. So if we're going to move forward, I do think that adaptation is crucially important, but that means there must be more clarity and more legal backing. There must be more money for the Environment Agency so that it can do its job properly. And there must be more independence for it so that it can say to the government, I'm sorry, but you are not doing this, and we can't do that. Do you see what I mean? That's what we need to do.
I do. No, it's really strong, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people nodding in agreement. I'm going to ask you a final question, Lord Deben, and it's the question that I ask all of my guests. So on Planet Possible, we have a magic wand, and the magic wand enables you to make anything possible. So if I passed you the magic wand and you gave it a wave, what would you make possible?
I think if I had a magic wand, I would make possible that everybody would see that climate change is merely the symptom of what we've done to the world, and that the disease is the pollution of the seas, the pollution of the air, the way we've treated other people, modern slavery and the like, and that what we have to do is to learn again that we have to look after the soil. We have to respect what has been given to us. We didn't make this planet. It was given to us, and we need to be stewards of it. And if everyone's eyes were opened to that, then all these other things that we've been talking about, we'd be able to deliver, because they'd understand that that's exactly what we have to do, because that is our duty as human beings.
Well, that is a perfect and rather inspiring note to end on. So thank you. A huge thank you for joining us on Planet Possible, Lord Deben. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it a lot. Goodbye.
So, Susan, what are some of your initial reflections on the interview?
I thought it was a really fascinating interview, and I thought Lord Deben raised some really key points. I probably would start off with COP27, actually. I mean, it kind of amazes me that it's the 27th annual convention, and I think really over the last couple of years it's really sort of become much more well known. And the reason for that for me is that I think that people can see climate change now for themselves. They see that first-hand experience. So, you know, I was reflecting on some of the things that Lord Deben was saying around just what we're experiencing. You know, even if you look back last year, the floods in Pakistan, they had rain non-stop for 8 weeks, killed over 1,000 people, wildfires in California, 7,500 fires in 2022, which burn over 400,000 acres. And then you look at our climate, you look at the fact we had 2 heat waves last summer where it was temperatures over 40 degrees. You've got the droughts that we're thinking about. So I think certainly Lord Deben really focused on that and really, I think, made me reflect on some of the things that we're all seeing and what people are seeing. I think the other bit, the overarching bit that I absolutely agree with, and I think that is a real key important point, is this action. You know, what do we all do? You know, there's things that we can do. It's not always easy to know what to do and where to start. And there is a real link to the cost of living. But 2030 is only 7 years away, and we need to kind of get on with things. And I think that was one of the key things. I think the other final point that kind of really struck me with Lord Deben's interview was the role of businesses. You know, he touched on the new Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero, but I really aligned to his point around the fact that it's based on outcomes, not policy, that delivery really matters. So yeah, really interesting points and really, I think, cut to the nub of it.
I guess coming to exactly that point then, really, which is how do we focus on delivery? When you're working with businesses and arguably individuals, because that's what businesses are made up of, in this kind of space, where do you advise that they should start?
Where do you start with this sort of topic? There's such a strong message that has come out of, you know, even if you look back again at COP27 around not crossing that 1.5 degrees temperature limit. And I think generally the organisations that I see, they know that they need to act, But there is a real but. And I think the but for me is that it feels complicated. Even in and around the discussions that I have, it's full of jargon. It's a confusing landscape with lots of different approaches and lots of different measures. And, I really think that there's some great intentions within organisations and different places. But where are the plans? And personally, I love a plan. I couldn't live my life without a plan. But where are they? And I think that's the key point for me when I look across different organisations. And I think the other side of it is often that priorities are just not joined up. Climate change, net zero, sustainability can sometimes feel that it's the side act, that people are focusing on the day job and all of those good things. But when does this become the day job? When does it that people start to go, do you know what, this has to be central in what we're actually doing? And I have some real empathy for small businesses because they don't have dedicated resources. They don't know what to focus on and it's a lot harder. The key thing for me though is that this has to be, I think, really considered like any other change programme. We're going through change. Organisations and all of us day to day have to think differently, have to do something different. And actually, if you think even in terms of COVID, how many organisations and how did we all adapt so quickly to a changing landscape that I think we recognise and organisations kind of recognise that there's an emergency, but I'm not seeing enough where people are doing something to make that real difference.
So where you have seen examples where that change has started to happen and it has been grasped, I guess what's the magic ingredients there? Have you seen anything in those organisations that you can attribute to why that change is happening and why that organisation is able to transition more than in other organisations where there might be inertia? I mean, is it leadership? What does it come down to, do you think, from what you've seen?
I think it comes down to behavioural change. So I think if you're wanting people to do something different, then how do you make that happen? I mean, I was only thinking the other day, I think it was just over 20 years ago, where we would just put out our waste in a black bag or a single wheelie bin or whatever. You wouldn't do that today. We're used to the fact of having household waste that's actually being separated. When you go to the tip, happily put them in different bins. So you have to change people's behaviour and that's no different in everyday life to organisations. So of course it has to come back to leadership. It has to come back to that organisation being absolutely committed to saying we're going to be a net zero organisation and we're going to put the steps in place to make that happen, and thinking broadly across what that looks like. So, understanding what's important to customers, that's a really good place to start because that's generally what most organisations are doing. But then thinking around, okay, well, how do I change not just the way in which we operate, but the way in which the organisation operates, and how do I really get my organisation on board? How do I get everybody bought into it? And really start to measure and start to reward best practice and recognise that actually doing something different might actually cost a little bit more money, and it might be investment, but ultimately it's going to make that big difference that we all need to make.
And if I came to you as an individual, because, as I said earlier on, really, all companies is a collection of individuals. And, you and I both sort of spent a good 20 years or so working in and around water and, for you, electricity and the environment. Are there changes that you found you've made over the last whatever period of time, last few years, that are more aligned to what you're doing at work? Are you finding it easy to make some of those transitions?
It's not always easy, is it? Because I think that the general things we all tend to do, we all tend to recycle, we all tend to turn your lights off when you leave a room and turn the tap off and those sorts of things. But, there's some great ideas out there, and I think the younger generation just seem to get it. They've got this passion for sustainable products, knowing where something is coming from, not just buying it because it's the quickest and easiest thing to get, but actually thinking, okay, well, can we purchase more locally and can we think about those sorts of things? I think, looking around recycling of clothing, there's so many different sites now where I think people are really happy to think about pre-loved items, the upcycling of furniture, and also just having that different view of food and produce, and going vegan, every day, if whether you want to do it every day or even if it's just one day a week. And I had some friends over and I cooked vegan, and I'm not vegan, but it was delicious. I just felt that it was the right thing to do, and that you can't just continue to do the things that you used to do or have done for a while. It's about recognising that there has to be this start of behavioural change and putting new ways of thinking into practice, and there isn't time to wait. We can't just keep putting it off. And I think that Lord Deben really brought that home, and I think the work that he's doing with the Climate Change Committee really focuses on that priority to act and do the things that are important.
So what's still difficult? If there were things that you could just unstick a little bit, wheels you could grease, feel free to borrow the magic wand if you want it, but what would you want to change?
I definitely want the magic wand, because,
all right, it's all yours.
I'd ask for it for a number of different magic wands, but I think the key thing for me is this thinking that we've still got time. Businesses need real business change that makes a difference and delivers those tangible outcomes. So I think my magic wand would be for every organisation to recognise their role and know that it's important. What they do today will be so important for the future. So, let's put that plan in place. I said I love a plan, and I think that's the key thing. It's you have to put that step in front of you. You need to start acting now, whether that's around putting the right resources in place or changing the way you operate, or really beginning to lead on this from the top, or working with your supply chain. It's around really making that difference and doing it now and not putting it off for any longer.
Do you think there's any more that could be done from a government perspective, in terms of incentivising or the way we think about accounting for climate change? Is there anything else that businesses need aside from, I think what I've heard you describe is about leadership, is about change management, is about grasping the nettle really and recognising this has got to be done. But when we think about the business community and what really motivates a business community, is there anything else that you'd want to change that you think might be able to accelerate some of that transition aside from what we've just talked through?
I think it's about making it less complicated. I've already touched on the fact that there's lots of approaches, lots of measures out there, different ways of evaluating how you're doing. Yeah, if there's an opportunity to make it more simple and easy for an organisation or for anybody to kind of really attack this, then we should do it. I think that where organisations or sectors would benefit from incentives, then we should absolutely consider that, because if there are obstacles in the way, and cost is often cited as an obstacle, then it's looking and working in partnership together at central government, local government, with different committees, with different parties to say, okay, how do we deal with this collectively? Because this isn't just one person's problem. This is all of our problems, and what we can do in our own individual lives is great, and we should do that and contribute. But equally, we do need businesses and we need government, we need everybody to come together, and that's what things like COP27 really promote, is that sort of joined up working and joined up thinking.
Yeah, far too complicated for any one player, isn't it, of course?
Yeah.
So, any final thoughts? You've heard the chair of the Climate Change Committee. We're bringing in your experience working with all sorts of organisations in your current role and previous roles. If we were to offer listeners your kind of final reflections and maybe a call to action, what would you want to leave them with?
I'd just say, don't be put off by it. It is complicated sometimes. There's a lot of really good organisations out there that are really driving forward, changing their business. There's lots of people that are changing the way that they live their lives every day and adopting a much more of a greener living approach, which is great. Don't be put off by it. One foot in front of the other. Start leading on these issues. Start putting those plans in place and get going on it, because 7 years is going to fly by and we've got more work to do beyond 2030. So the quicker we all start making a difference, I think the better.
I feel the sense to go and write a plan immediately after our conversation, Susan. You've inspired me. But as ever, time has flown by, it always does, and we are already at the end of the episode. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for all your reviews and ratings as well, and helping us continue to top the Earth Sciences podcast charts. I really hope you found the conversations insightful. They've given you something to think about in your world. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to ensure you never miss an episode. All that leads me to say is a huge thank you to our excellent guest today, the Right Honourable John Gummer, Lord Deben, and my superb co-host, Susan Stockwell. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thanks, Niki.
Just one more thing to tell you about before we go. On Planet Possible, we talk a lot about innovation, but we also like to innovate ourselves. We've partnered with a new technology called Accordion that lets you take control of the length of a podcast whilst keeping the tone, structure and feel of the original. So if you want to catch up on our previous episodes in a really time-efficient way, or maybe you've not got the time to listen to the full version of the latest episode, just go to accordion.live/Planet Possible and you can listen at a length that suits the time you have available. That's accordion.live/Planet Possible. That's it, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Planet Possible is produced by Bwlb. Bwlb Bwlb. The best ideas, the strongest content.